People often say that Jack and I look alike, but the similarity ends there. Jack loves running around the track countless number of times, whereas I prefer something a little less boring, such as soccer. He inhales his food in less than a minute, while I prefer to take my time. 4 cell phones through the washer and 6 crushed in some other way. Jack is now on his 11th cell phone since his 8th grade year. I'm still on my first. However, even with all of our differences, Jack has been my primary role model in my life. It is because of our differences that Jack has helped me and many others become better people. Although no one is perfect, I believe Jack is pretty close to that standard. While I was busy worrying about my history paper or my first crew race, Jack would come home and ask me how my day was and brighten the whole day up. And that's typical of Jack. His joy spreads to other people. One night, when Jack and I were home alone, our depressed neighbor rang our doorbell. I was pretty creeped out, but Jack simply walked outside and sat with the old woman for 2 hours and just talked to her. By the time the woman went back home, she actually had a smile on her face. I have thought about that night, and I realized that the woman who visited that day was extremely lucky and that she came to our house, for if she went anywhere else in the neighborhood, she would have been rejected. But Jack is one of the select few people who genuinely cares for others, and excluding the time he forgot to pick me up late at night because he was too busy sleeping, I know Jack will always be there for me no matter where he goes to college next year.
At age 3, Jack and I had the world figured out. We had it made. After we got home from the West Hill School, where incidentally we got what we got, we would go to one of our houses and play outside, usually looking for buried treasure or playing football for hours on end. On the brink of exhaustion, we would go inside to find one of our mothers, where one of our mothers could only stare blankly at the amount of dirt that had accumulated on our white-collared shirts. From there, we would enjoy a cold juicy juice and watch a movie until Mom came back with Jack's favorite chocolate cake. Now, the sad part of this story is that now, at age 18, not a whole lot has changed. I mean, now he's 6'4", so I can actually physically look up to him. And I'm pretty sure his cake preference has changed, but that's about it. This is pretty indicative of Jack as a person. He's the rare kind of kid that isn't easily changed by his surroundings, and Jack has had plenty of them. Despite a heartbreaking move to Minnesota after the 5th grade, then South Carolina, then back to Minnesota, and eventually back to Philly, Jack remained that goofy Philly kid at heart. Sure, he can run like a gazelle and do math at an Einsteinian level, and carry Elise's book bag like a pro. But what is more impressive is that he does it with such grace, humility, and dignity. And that is what has always impressed me about Jack. Somehow his superhuman talent hasn't gotten to his head yet. Ever since the age of 3, from football to fight club, from college to calculus, Jack has been there for me every step of the way. Jack said that you get what you get at the West Hill School. Well, I got a best friend, a role model, and a mentor, which is more than I ever could have asked for. Please stand to greet Jack Freese.
Please be seated. Thank you, Will and Timmy, who are my 2 favorite ex-redheads. One of my favorite memories is actually of that ex-redhead of a brother of mine, Timmy. When I was 4 and a half, my mom told me that I was going to have a little brother, and I was so excited. Until this point, the only person I had to play with was Lissa, who despite being the nicest person in the whole world now, was, at the time, a very cunning 3-year-old girl. Cunning, you might ask? A 3-year-old? Yes, cunning. You see, my sister Lissa was somehow able to convince me that if I played Barbie dolls with her, she would fight my toy nights with me. I played with Lissa for hours. Looking back, if I thought I was tired at the end of those playing sessions, I can't even imagine what it must have been like for Ken, considering he went on at least 100 dates by the time we were finished. Finally, though, it was time to play nights, but Lissa would play for 2 minutes and then quit and nullify our agreement, claiming I had done something that broke it. After all those hours Ken and I put in together, no nights. But the most amazing part, and the part that makes her cunning, is how she was able to get me to agree to that same deal over and over again. even though every time she found a way to get out of playing nights. So when I heard that I was having a baby brother, I was excited because now I'd have a boy to play with. He wouldn't nullify our agreements, he wouldn't make me play Barbies, and he would understand me in my nights. When Timmy arrived home from the hospital, he was greeted at the entryway by the most extravagant setup of nights my household had ever seen, as well as a soon-to-be devastated older brother Jack, who learned the hard way that day that babies can't really do anything except burp, eat, and hog attention. That was a good memory, and I have a lot of them. But today I'm actually going to talk about the lessons that can be learned from a bad one, or rather, one that should have been worse than it is. Just a heads up, this is going to be a pretty serious speech, and on that note, I ask that you hold applause at the end. When I was in 8th grade, my dad had a heart attack. He was about to board an airplane home to South Carolina from Minnesota, and as he sat in the terminal, ironically with a Big Mac in hand, he had a heart attack. Luckily for him, he happened to be sitting next to an off-duty EMT, who are the guys that work in ambulances. The EMT performed some techniques that allowed my dad to be revived in the ambulance when it arrived 8 minutes later and to not incur brain damage. After 2 major surgeries, he's thankfully alive today. The interesting thing to me, though, about this event was my lack of response. I was very, very close to my dad, and still am today. But when I heard that he had a heart attack, I didn't even really miss a beat. And while friends and extended family members initially praised me for my strength, I look back now and realize that I was not at all being strong. Rather, I was falling into one of the worst of human tendencies, the shell shock response. The response that we have when we hear something so bad, we can't believe it's true. In response to my dad's heart attack, I just kept going on with my life as if nothing had happened. And I bring this memory up because I think that this shell shock response is one of the biggest problems in the world. That when something's wrong, we just keep going on as if nothing happened, even though it did. It's an avoidance of real truth. It's humankind as a group failing to follow facts and evidence to their full conclusions. And today I'm going to talk about a few of the most absurd of these cases, because you can't just ignore bad things. You have to deal with things that are tough, because things that are tough aren't cutting deals for you. Number 1, the oil spill. I'll be the first to say that the spill was horrible and that BP deserves criticism for their blatant disregard for safety precautions, causing the loss of 4.1 million barrels of oil into the Gulf. But here's where my problem lies. Did you know that more oil than was spilled in the Gulf of Mexico during the BP oil spill is spilled in Nigeria every single year? For probably 6 months, there was not a single day where our BP oil spill didn't make the front page of every newspaper and some report wasn't debuted on every news channel. We were fixated on that spill and tore apart the BP executives that had allowed for the oversight. But here's my question, and it should be yours. Why only BP and why only when it's on our beach? Countless headlines and papers read, BP spill, largest oil accident on record. What? What does that make the oil spilled in Nigeria every year, and for that matter, the rest of Africa and the Gulf states? Deliberate oil spills? Number 2, I'm not sure how many people have heard about it, but this summer I learned about something called the Pacific Garbage Dump. And it is, for those who don't know, a giant pile of trash the size of Texas that just sits in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. That's the equivalent of 6 Pennsylvanias worth of trash, just sitting there in the middle of the largest body of water on Earth. Well, I think that this speaks for itself. I just want to elaborate on how bad this really is. I doubt anyone could honestly say that they do not see that giant trash heap as a problem, but still no one wants to fix it. And what makes it scarier is the fact that the Pacific garbage dump consists primarily of plastic, which essentially never decomposes. In other words, if we don't clean it up, it's going to stay there. To add to that, commercial plastic was only invented 102 years ago, and we already have a pile of trash 6 times the size of our state. And then, on top of that, the world economy is speeding up and plastic production is increasing exponentially. If you add those 3 up, it's a pretty terrifying picture. In 1 century, we've created a garbage dump as big as Texas that will never decompose, and now world production of plastic is higher than it's ever been before. I wonder where that leaves us in the future. Number 3, anyone that went here to EA in lower school will remember the waves of Pokemon, Yu-Gi-Oh, and Magic that swept the school by force. I know that when I naively traded away my Blue Eyes White Dragon and polymerization card to Bobby Svigals in what can only be described as the Rook of the Century, I was the talk of the 4th grade for a day. And if you can remember those trading cards, you probably can also remember how parents and older kids laughed at us for playing with them. But what recently I've been thinking about is that our parents were doing the same thing. People always talk about how genius the people were who thought up of selling trading cards. They made so much money selling 100 different orange pieces of paper with anime pictures of monsters. But here's a hypothetical. What if there were a group of people who, instead of 100 cards, made 5? Who instead of anime monsters put really old men on the card, and instead of orange paper chose green paper? What I recently realized is that's a dollar bill. The only difference between those 5 bills and our Pokemon cards is that whoever made the bill didn't just make a bunch of kindergartners think that their card had value. They have the entire world convinced. Who's the genius now? Moving on to my central idea with this, just think about what people do to get dollars. People do the most absurd and horrible things to get what is, when it comes down to it, nothing more than a trading card. And that's the last example I'm going to give because I don't have much more time and many are inappropriate for a chapel talk. But the thing is, there are many, many more. What I hope you take away is that though there is much in this world that is good and worth enjoying, there's also much that needs work. But the sad recent tendency is to turn away from that less pleasurable part. Instead of following facts and evidence to their full conclusions, we hop off spiritually, mentally, and physically just before the results start getting hard to handle. Sometimes we empathize, but there's an important distinction between empathy and caring. Empathy involves an understanding of another's feelings. Caring involves action to help them. In order to love, you have to care. Throughout history, many groups have pointed and continue to point to the man or bourgeoisie or some other elite group that is the supposed perpetrator of major crimes against humanity. There are literally countless conspiracy theories about the elite government leaders somehow hurting the rest of the world if you go online and look. I would like to suggest a new one, though, and one that does not fit the mold of any of the others. In my conspiracy theory, there is no man. In my conspiracy theory, the entire world is the unknowing conspirator, and the victims are ourselves. We just still haven't left our state of hiding from the truth. We are still in a state of shell shock and feigned ignorance. And that's why I speak to you today, Episcopal, and ask that as you grow here and beyond, you work to leave that state of shell shock, because you now most certainly know. Don't allow yourself to be herded into a life where you ignore the truth in favor of the convenient. Mr. Clark's favorite saying is, "To those whom much is given, much is required," from the Gospel of Luke, and I couldn't agree more. We have more opportunity here in a year than most people do in a lifetime, but what defines you is what you choose to do with it. I ask that you use that opportunity to do something to help the world around you and better it, because there is no point in being great unless you're doing it for something greater than yourself. Thank you.